I've got a question for you today. When you think of the word boundaries, do you consider it positive or is it negative? Do you think of in terms of restrictions and constraints, or does it bring to your mind freedom and growth and fullness? Well, today might be a really good day to change your mind. What if setting appropriate boundaries could protect your mental health and cultivate better overall quality of life? And what if the Bible can help you do it? Today, you'll meet licensed clinical social worker Kat Elias, who will share with you her personal journey to discovering the benefits of setting good boundaries and what the Bible can teach you about it. If you're new here, you are welcome here. And if you're not new, welcome back. We are Women in Apologetics, and we exist to educate, encourage, and equip Christian women to defend their faith with confidence and grace. This is our July episode of Voices of WIA, and we are so glad that you are here with us today. But before we get started, I want to remind you of the opportunity to join us live at our annual conference in Nashville this September. It's the only place that you will find apologetics training specifically for women by women, which means that our conference gives you the most unique in-person, face-to-face opportunities to grow in your Christian walk and develop your distinctly Christian mind. So if you haven't bought your tickets to the conference yet, you can scan the QR code on the screen or go to our website at womeninapologetics.com/2024 WIA WIAConf. We're going to jump right in, and I am thrilled for you to meet Kat Elias. She's a licensed clinical social worker who's been in the field for 20 years. She founded BeaYOUtifully Rooted, a Christian mental health and education corporation for women. She produces the Rooted and Edified Show, a conservative Christian podcast, which she co-hosts with her husband, Manny. Kat and Manny live in California and have a blended family with 7 children. She homeschools her 4 youngest children and recently began a Christian gift business. She currently serves on the board of the Association of Christians in Health and Human Services. She loves puns, salsa music, and running. Plus, she has her certificate in Christian apologetics from Biola. Is that correct, Kat?
Yes, it is. Right down the street.
Welcome, Kat. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I cannot wait to have this discussion with you. I'm so glad you're here. How are you this morning?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you for having me. I love what you guys do. I'm a fan of Women in Apologetics, and I just thank Jesus for you guys. You guys are great.
Thanks. Likewise. Okay. So based on the conversations that you and I have had together as we prepared for this episode, you have sold me on the value of setting boundaries for our mental, emotional, and spiritual health. But before we talk boundaries and their relationship to understanding the character of God, which I think is really neat to think about, and the Bible, can you describe your background and how you came to appreciate this topic so much?
Absolutely. In short, God transformed my life. And I grew up with a dynamic young family who was trying to learn how to do life. And I kind of was learning how to do life with them. And I learned some great things. And I learned some things that I needed to relearn. And one of those things was boundaries. And after a series of humbling events that showed my lack of boundaries, I quickly knew that I needed to do something different. I was very desperate to make changes in my life and in relationships. And I was full of anxiety and lots of various facets. I was too sensitive. I had bad relationships. I was constantly the source of crisis intervention or the go-to person. And I thought in terms of strength and weakness. And I found that I could sacrifice with endurance. And it just definitely led to me knowing that I needed to surrender that to God. And He led me down a path of relearning boundaries. And I read some material on boundaries from Henry Cloud and John Townsend, as many of you guys probably know. They're great. I read some books on codependency, on anger, on personality disorders, more books on boundaries. And I started attending a boundaries group, and it made a big difference in my life. And I also started consulting with friends who gave me black and white live examples of how I might be able to set boundaries verbally. And it just changed. It was a game changer for me. And I started practicing them, and I started getting a reasonable confidence in doing it, and my life changed. And then as a therapist, once I had learned boundaries, I thought, wow, I'm so surprised at how much of counseling is actually a need to relearn boundaries and healthy relationships, and those kind of go hand in hand. So as a Bible-believing Christian, once I became one, a Bible-reading Christian, I saw how important the topic is in the Christian community, and I'm hoping to open up a Christian-focused boundary center here. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Wow. Yeah, it's a great story, though. It's so much fun. I mean, how awesome is it? Were you a therapist before you discovered the whole boundary concept?
You know, I was in college when God started working my life in that. And so I was gearing towards that. But it was kind of a series over time that I learned it. So eventually I started learning the boundaries as a therapist, but I started learning a little bit before that.
Okay. Because one of the conversations that you and I had was that I thought was so interesting, and I want to make sure we plug it in and don't forget it, is that you mentioned that a lot of emotional reasoning and pain avoidance interferes with our ability to understand who God is, and that the concept of setting boundaries and understanding what boundaries are helps us to undo some of those really negative implications of those ideas. Can we talk about that really quickly? Because I don't want our audience to miss that. I think that's one of the most important points that you and I talked about, is that boundaries help us understand all those things. And so just kind of help us figure out what is the deal with emotional reasoning, and how does boundaries help that? And how does all of that help us to understand God better?
Yeah, sure. I think it's super important for what we're going through now in society, because in therapy, we used to treat something that was called emotional reasoning, which is that we believe that what we feel is truth because we feel it. And we recognize that as a cognitive distortion. In therapy before, we would treat that. We would challenge cognitive distortions. That's a big part of cognitive behavioral therapy. But now that's kind of the way of life. I'm not really sure what is going on in the therapy world with that. Our world kind of feels like our emotions are truth. And that's actually more important than truth if facts are presented. So I think that definitely has an impact on how we live life. It definitely contributes to a lot. And when I refer to boundaries, I'm referring to the lines that separate us from other people, what we're responsible for, we're not responsible for, the lines that tell other people what's okay, what's not okay, we will subject ourselves to. But also it refers to the boundaries. Boundaries refer to the limits that we set with ourselves. And so I think when it comes to emotional reasoning, that's where we have to start setting limits with ourselves to help us choose healthy emotions, thoughts, behaviors, habits, relationships, choices, things like that.
So it sounds like to me one of the most important boundaries we can set is the boundary of truth. Like, certain things are feelings, but that doesn't cross the line. It doesn't actually meet the requirement to be truth. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah, I think that we should believe that what is true, not just because we feel it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. I think that's a really important, relevant, like you said, so much in our culture tells us that if we feel it, it's true. And that isn't true. So that's a really important boundary.
That can damage relationships. That can impact just how we deal with coping. If we're not interpreting reality as reality,
right,
we can definitely lead to anxiety, depression, lots of different things.
Of course. That makes so much sense to me. You have accurately described our culture as boundaryless, which I think is a very, very pivotal insight, because we tend to see boundaries, most of us do anyway, as mean or harsh or punitive. But you and I talked about how God in Scripture sets boundaries all the time, and particularly in Genesis, when he makes distinctions in the very, very beginning, which ultimately result in the order and the harmony of the universe. So when you and I set boundaries in our lives, it tends to create order and harmony and productivity in our own lives. So what kind of symptoms might we see in our lives if we don't set boundaries?
Well, I'm going to try to speak a little bit slower, because sometimes I forget that I speak pretty quickly, and I'm pretty sure people are already thinking that. So I'm going to slow down. And when I think about the symptoms that come up with because we have a lack of boundaries, man, it affects our spiritual life. It affects our mental health. It affects our emotional life. It affects our relationships, our physical well-being. It also affects our finances. So if we're speaking spiritually, biblically, if we're speaking, I think that what we see when we lack boundaries is we start drifting away from God and his ways. We start increasing sinfulness. We have a moral downfall, I think, individually, as a society, and as a church. We see biblically that not honoring God's boundaries and not setting boundaries with our flesh to be able to respect God's boundaries has led to idolatry, worshiping the self or others, over concern with pleasure, even when it's been noted to be abominable. I think we see that very clearly with Solomon. He's a very clear case. Love of pleasure, love of women, 1,000 is a lot. Letting in idolatry. And the Bible tells us in 1 Kings 11 that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord, his God. And we see him come to a spiritually low place, emotional despair. We see the book of Ecclesiastes being birthed. Now, practically speaking, when we lack boundaries in our own life, it does affect our own spiritual walk. So our spiritual discipline, we neglect our prayer life. If we don't read the Bible regularly, How do we have a biblical worldview if we don't know it? If we know the word, but we're not in our word continuously, then how do we beat our flesh into submission? Like Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 9:27, lest we be disqualified, and none of us want that. We also see a ripple effect, because when we don't have good boundaries and we're not in our spiritual disciplines, it's hard to teach others, and we see a lack of discipleship, as Titus 2 kind of commands us. As a church, I think we see symptoms with not setting proper limits. We see things like a total watered down biblical worldview. Even sometimes taking an anti-biblical stance, we have a weak impact on the world as a result. There are churches that endorse and tolerate love is love, same-sex couples being married or marrying them in the church. We support babies being murdered in the womb. We don't speak against those things, and we allow important biblical concepts to be redefined without pushback. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. We have empathy without discernment. We speak love and not truth. I think we see a parallel to the church of Corinth in 1 Corinthians 5, in which Paul speaks of the church tolerating sin that not even pagans would tolerate. And oh my goodness, I think we are there. And if we're thinking also spiritually, we want to remember that not setting proper boundaries leads to bad doctrine, wildfire spreading within the church. I think we've seen that with organizations like BLM that promotes breakdown of the family unit. Relationally, I think we see unhealthy, chaotic, unsatisfactory, bitter relationships, needy relationships, crisis-oriented relationships, impulsivity, being unequally yoked, having harmful or abusive relationships, and our relationships become disingenuous because boundaries help keep the good and the bad out. And then lastly, I think emotionally and behaviorally, physically and financially, I think we see with a lack of boundaries, excessive stress, anxiety, depression, frustration, anger, rage, avoidant behaviors, a whole bunch. Unregulated stress and coping impacts our physical health, like autoimmune disorders. We might get preventable diseases. We find ourselves maybe significantly overweight or underweight. We might have unmanaged medical conditions, and that's very important. And we might have poor financial management. There's a whole list that I can go into. Parenting, we might turn our lack of boundaries in parenting can turn into an enabling, undisciplined or over-disciplined mess, and our kids then are not able to connect their consequences with their actions. So I could go on for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just impressed listening to you kind of explain, or at least delineate, all the different aspects and spheres of our lives that are impacted when we don't set boundaries correctly. And I'm wondering if you could boil that down into a kind of a summary statement. Why does boundary setting matter so much? What is it they accomplish? You said something that I would love for you to unpack if you can, real briefly. That they primarily serve, if I understand you correctly, they primarily serve to keep certain things out and certain things in, and to sort of delineate territories. Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So boundaries are limits that we set to keep the good in and to get the bad out, which is what we want to do in our Christian faith. We see God set boundaries. We see him set boundaries from the very get-go. He told Adam what is good, what is not good. We see him create and draw lines between animals and people that are made in God's image, and that people would have dominion over those things. And that was good. That was before the fall. Those were good things. Like I said, God has boundaries. These boundaries are made to help keep the good in and the bad out. So when you're in a relationship that has some things come up, they're maybe not so good, or things you need to check out, well, boundaries helps you to set those limits, at least to address it with assertiveness. You address it, you give the other person a chance to kind of to work on it. And that will give a chance for just the good keeps in. If the bad continues, there's consequences for that. And that keeps genuinity in your relationship. It gives a chance for the bad to go out. And it's just a good thing in relationships. It gives you a chance not to develop bitterness, which is what happens when you allow something to go unboundaried for so long. You start getting anger, bitterness, and that's a killer for relationships. And a lot of times we will get apathetic, which is no good for your soul, which is no good for your emotions, which is no good for your relationship. And it can easily turn into depression. So boundaries help keep the good in and let the bad out.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of back to Genesis, the overall concept of dominion. God gave us the Garden of Eden, and He set us in it and gave us dominion, said, go and fill it up and
Right.
occupy it and develop it. And so if we're going to have proper dominion over our spheres, whether that's our family, our relationships, our finances, or our physical health, or whatever it may be,
Yeah,
those boundaries help us establish proper dominion, what we're
that's right.
responsible for. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. And I think also that boundaries, as with keeping the good in and letting the bad out, I think that that also applies to developing a Christ-like character. Because if you look at Galatians and the fruit of the Spirit, almost every single one has to do with boundaries. You have to have an ability to regulate yourself and to set limits with yourself in order to to develop that character that's Christ-like, in order to walk the walk that is a Christ-like walk. It's very
Sure.
important. We want to preserve, because God made us relational. We want to preserve the authenticity of our relationships, goodness, and keep from the abusive things. It's super important. I also think that boundaries help to protect us from long-term anxiety, depression, dissatisfaction. It can even help us heal from past traumas, which I think is so important, because sometimes when we're little or at whatever age, somebody's overstepped our boundaries. We learn we don't need them. We learn we're not deserving of having those things. We don't learn how to set them or that we can have them. But when you're older, you can relearn those things and you can say, well, now when I'm able to, I can learn to set boundaries. I can set boundaries, and there's an empowerment that happens that I think is very healing. I also think that boundaries can change the course of generational difficulties that have been passed down from generations. When one generation doesn't get better, you can make a difference once you learn boundaries for your generation and the following ones. And I think that also boundaries help us to understand the Bible better. The Bible is full of boundaries, full of limits, full of directions. God tells us that He wants our joy to be full, and that if we love Him, we'll keep His commandments. And if you don't understand boundaries, it's very hard to understand how God can say what He says, how God can draw a line between what is a good relationship, what is bad, what is good behavior, what's bad, how there can be consequences for us. And so our Bible reading and understanding can improve once our understanding boundaries improves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of that verse that talks about catching all the little foxes. I think it's in Song of
Yeah,
Solomon. If you catch, it's almost like unweeding your garden. As the weeds pop up, you don't just let the weeds grow. You have to take them
I love
out
that.
so they don't choke out the good growth. So that actually raises,
I
I
love that.
think, a really important question, because, like you said earlier, we do live in kind of a boundaryless society. There's all sorts of calls for your truth and my truth, and they're all valid and they're all the same. Well, that's really kind of an applied idea of there shouldn't be boundaries. That's the idea behind sameness, and whatever word you might choose to put on it, is the idea that boundaries shouldn't exist, or that they are punitive in some way, or harsh in some way. So
Or unchristian.
what happens? Oh, go ahead.
Or unchristian. Sometimes people think that they're not
Oh,
Christian-like.
yeah, that's a very good point. Very valid point. What happens if you and I were not raised in a family or a church family or just a society to value good boundaries, or we're not raised with the skills to know how to set them? That would really set someone up for a situation where their life becomes chaotic. And like you said, when life is chaotic and we all think we're doing the right things, but we keep doing the things that we're told are right, but they don't ever really deliver what we think they will, then that sets us up for all sorts of anger and frustration and hopelessness and that sort of thing. So are we stuck, or is setting boundaries something that we can actually learn?
Well, the beautiful thing is that boundaries are not genetic. It's not something that's in your DNA per se. This is something that is learned one way or another, whether it was from direct learning of how somebody set limits or didn't set limits, or whether it was a response to someone overstepping their boundaries or not having enough, or whatever it is. Boundaries are learnable, even if you've lived a long time without them, even if your relationships are a little chaotic, and you can still implement boundaries. They are learnable. It's very important that you know that you can learn skills to do that. And in a second, we can talk about how do you learn those skills. Like I was mentioning, you can change the course of how your generations go, hopefully with you learning how to set boundaries. And when you do that, sometimes what you'll see is, at first, somebody's symptoms might come up, but there's something that happens kind of like what I call a popcorn effect, where other people in your family start getting better. So how do we learn how to set these boundaries?
Yeah, that would be my next question for sure.
Yeah. So I just want to put a disclaimer out there. If somebody is in an abusive relationship, it's very important that you get a consultation with somebody who can go over your specific case, because sometimes when you do set those boundaries in a domestic violence situation or abusive situation, your risk of violence goes up. And I want you to enter into it wisely before you do that. So you can call the National Crisis Hotline at 988 to speak to somebody or to get referrals, or the domestic violence hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. 7233. So learning how to set boundaries. It is doable. You need to start with reviewing your current circumstances in your life, which relationships that you have, what's good and not good. You need to find some source of education somewhere. There are things that are out there. You may go to counseling, but just have good discernment about which counselor you choose.
Yeah.
It's a little tricky nowadays. Boundaries books or groups from John Townsend and Henry Cloud, they're great. They've done amazing work for many, many years. Sometimes you'll find those groups at bigger churches that offer support groups. You can consult with friends and loved ones who are amazing with boundaries. That can be very helpful. Ask for their feedback. You can read articles, do web searches, look on videos on YouTube. Beautifully Rooted has, I think we have like 300 videos. Many of them are on boundaries. You can check that out on YouTube. It's spelled BeaYOU. Our podcast, The Rooted and Edified Show, we have an episode on boundaries. You can check that out. You can also join groups like NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, Codependency Anonymous. There's lots of things out there that are available to you. And you want to make sure that you have an accountability and support system in place before you start setting these boundaries, because whatever kept you from setting boundaries in the first place, well, that's probably going to rise when you start setting boundaries, because the system kind of tries to sometimes people's symptoms increase because they want to get you back to, sometimes they don't understand, but they want to get you back to having those lack of boundaries. So if you weren't able to set them in the first place, you need to have extra support to continue. And then you might see the symptoms go down, and you can start setting boundaries. It may sound funny, but prepare, practice, be strategic, start small, grow bigger in your boundaries. Start small, start with small things. As you progress, move on to more important boundaries. Decide what kind of person you want to be before you set those limits to help you with setting those limits. Make a decision that you want to set the boundary. Don't base it on just emotion. And stay strong in your word, prayer, worship, and fellowship. And sometimes when we set boundaries, emotional stuff will come up for us, family of origin stuff. And so you want to make sure that you have a place to go to handle those emotions. Just know that they might come up, and you know what will motivate you. So if it's healthy, even if it's thinking outside the box, do it.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. It seems like to me, just from listening to you talk, even more than the conversation you and I had in preparing for this episode, that boundaries have a lot to do with habits. That if we're going to set boundaries, one of the things we have to do is start establishing habits that lie within the boundaries. And one of the ways that we do that is, like you said, our prayer time, making that a habit allows us to draw strength from God to learn to set our new boundaries and keep them and stay committed to them. I think you would agree with me. You're welcome to chime in if you don't, that knowing God's character helps us to both set appropriate boundaries and be motivated to keep them. Would that be an accurate statement?
100%. Definitely.
Okay.
And I think in the process, grief comes up as we're learning how to set boundaries. And so you want to be strong. That's just what we do. But also, we need to have that relationship with the Lord. We need to rely on His strength, like you said. We need to be going to Him and surrendering that to Him, and getting that spiritual response from Him.
Yes, I love that. I love all of that. Acknowledging the benefits of self-control. I think most of the time we are conditioned to believe that self-control is unnecessarily harsh and unfruitful, when it really isn't. It's because we are fallen people, self-control is one of the most valuable skills that we can learn. And of course, God is more than willing to help us with that, because it's mentioned in that list that you mentioned in Galatians 5. That's part of the fruits of the Spirit. It's learning self-control. So yeah, I think this is such a helpful, practical discussion. That's one of the reasons I was so excited about talking with you today. It seems like to me that this is a really practical tool for all of us.
Yes, definitely. I
think so too.
I think we want to work towards letting our yes be a yes and our no be a no, to live biblically and to be more Christ-like. And these are things that are so important in our relationships and in our life and in our Christian walk. So I appreciate it. This topic, I have classes that can go from 2 to 4 hours. This can be an all-day topic. So I hope it was okay to throw those things out there in such a short amount of time. And I appreciate you even giving a chance for this to be heard. I do
Absolutely.
think it's important for our Christian walk.
I think it's such an interesting and fun and insightful episode, and not necessarily a topic that we cover all the time. So thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been really helpful. And so for our audience and our listeners and viewers, our 2024 WIA conference is in just a couple of months. And so if you've not registered yet, you should do so before the standard rate ends on August 13th. We would love to meet you in person. And I know that you would love everything we have to offer this year, that from Voices of WIA taping with a live studio audience to our incredible breakout speakers and our keynote speakers and our dessert soiree. You can learn all about those things by visiting our conference webpage at womeninapologetics.com/2024 WIA Conf, WIACONF. And while you're there, consider supporting our ministry with a donation, either a one-time gift or a regular monthly amount, and become a member of our Apologetics Collective. And if you would like to learn more about Kat Elias ministry at BeaYOUtifully Rooted, you can find their website at BeaYOUtifullyRooted.com, and you can follow her on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube straight from their website. As usual, you can learn more about Women in Apologetics by going to our website at womeninapologetics.com, and by following us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Women in Apologetics. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss a Voices of WIA episode or any of our other video resources. Next month, be sure not to miss our discussion in August with our guest, TZ Cannon, where we will be talking about loss alongside the topic of apologetics. So that's going to be a real interesting topic as well. I hope you'll join us for that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will see you next time. So from the entire WIA team, we hope that you're having a great summer, and we hope to see you at the 2024 WIA conference in just a couple of months. Love you, all of you. We'll see you next time.